Hi, I'm Yosnam, and I was blessed to join a doll repaint Discord created by Stitchwood Creations. A channel was started for a Pride collab because I casually asked if anyone was doing anything for June, and so I took it upon myself out of guilt to make sure that a collab could happen. In this doll repaint collab, we have Shelby KG dolls, Hedgie dolls, Heliophobian dolls, Stitchwood Creations, Yosnap, and Magikcat dolls. We're doing monochromatic colors of the pride flag because doing individual pride flags wasn't challenging or collabby enough for the people that were initially in the collab. This was not my choice, and the kids that tagged on last minute to fill in the gaps never got a chance to give their vote for the theme, but I guess the monochromatic colors of the progress flag that they did 2 years ago in 2021 was a long time ago. So we're doing it again. I feel so lucky that I get to be in such a cool and unique collab. Well, it's true. So I'll make a cool and unique doll that will definitely fit and not be some petty shit to prove that you shouldn't pin stupid shit on me. For that reason, I'm going to make something simple. A dragon. In blue, because I'm making her as versatile for as many pride flags as I can. I'm going to use this sound alongside an on-screen warning for anything that might need it, because this video is going to be voiceover heavy and really ranty. So let's get to it then. I'm marking off the parts of this 2006 Jumping Tawny Barbie doll that need to be chopped up. I thought I needed her arms to be in a different place than where they were. I also need some extra arms, and we're going to get those from this Draculaura. I need to chop all parts of it up as well. Now that I've got the idea down, I took the power tools to them. Here's what we have. The best way that I can think to get these things back together is to tie them up with wires. I'll bore holes for them to go in a few places. Her back needs to be really open, so I'll shave some of the front part down. I honestly should have made her body longer and wider, but I didn't. It's not incredibly detrimental, but consider the bulk of the body of your projects when you're making monsters. I know that the wires that I use can wrap around the groove in the shoulder joints that I have, but I was worried that the epoxy wasn't going to play nice. This does seem to be the only way that this is going to work at this point, so I guess we're going for it. It's cool that the way the wires were put in here gives it an extra hinge, which will be handy for later if I'm at all able to keep it working. I'll need more wires in her, but she's kind of falling apart right now. I'll put down some epoxy and leave her overnight so she can have a little bit more stability. I still need access to the inside of her, so I'm not going to cover any of the gaps in her yet, just where the current wires are. In the morning I can add a bunch more support wires and put in wires that are going to hold her arms. The groove in these shoulder joints is wider, so they're really loose on the wire no matter how much I try to squish them on there. I'll put in most of her wires before I glue together the bones of her wings. I found these cocktail stirrers at the dollar store, and they should work great as the space between the joints. I know that these plastics aren't going to stick nice together with just hot glue, but I thought I would only need it until I can get epoxy on them. I'll stuff a little bit of foil inside her to give support to the gaps between the wires for when I go in with some epoxy. I'm throwing on a thin layer because I really just need it to fill in those gaps and assist the wires in keeping her together. Wires and clay are a tag team in keeping my projects together. After it's dried for a while, I'll go back and add some more epoxy around her joints to make the shoulder areas. And also over her wing bones again. I just need these places to be sturdy. She's getting covered in Paperclay Delight later. This is a really sculpt heavy project that has a lot of curing time, so we either have a lot of flip-flopping or inconsistent footage. We're going with the latter, and you're gonna deal with it. While I was waiting on that to dry, I worked on her legs. As far as her feet go, I would love for them to have an ankle joint. To do that, I'll just wrap a wire around something so that I have like a hoop. You can probably use hardware loops for this piece, but I didn't feel like going to the store. Her leg is kind of thin, and it looks like I'm only going to be able to connect them with a single width of wire, so I'll leave ample tails on them. How are these going to help? Well, I can stuff in some clay in the hoop to make a rod for it. I'll use Super Sculpey for this because I'm going to make the base of her feet with the same stuff. I would love them to be heavy. To make them even heavier than the weight of the Super Sculpey, I'll mix in some tiny glass beads. I mixed up so much and then wound up basically just using what I had left over from Hazel. Blend in the clay rod with the base of the feet and they should stick together. Off camera, I threaded the wire through the hole that I made in her leg and wrapped it around to get some kind of a connection. I went over the connection with epoxy on just the leg part and not the foot part to make sure that the leg stays together. I also added a spur on the back of her leg so that the feet wouldn't bend too far back. Before we go any further, I should attach her legs to her body. Barbie had elastic hip joints, but none of the elastic that I had was up to the challenge no matter how tight I strung it. I thought about how I could do it with wire without stifling the rotation. Simple rotation was fine for this. I thought that I could drill a very stiff length of wire, namely a hanger, through her hips and cap it off at the outside. I don't think it should really matter whether you cap the leg or the wire itself if you can bend a good hook onto it, but I think I'll cap the wire anyway. I'll do that with some epoxy just to be secure. If it's any consolation to my collaborators, this was really frustrating and one of my teeth kind of fell apart in my head that day. Confidence really is the 8th sin. I'll continue on with the feet. Since it's okay that these are heavy, I'll use epoxy for it. I meant to go straight in with details because I don't want them to be too incredibly chunky, but I guess we're just going to use this layer to give her toes. I meant to trim the wick end of her Sculpey Ultralight talons before putting them onto her toes, but forgot until it was too late. So I'll trim them down and explain what they're made of later. After that cures for a while, I can add in the details. I did a little bit of research, looked at a few critters' feetsies, and mixed them together a little bit. I don't have the skills to give it the exact texture that I want, but as long as I don't say what that is, you don't know how bad I messed up. And even then it's not that bad, because I made all of the bigger scales individually. I used a rasp and the twisty part on a craft blade for the tread at the very bottom. I made individual scales all along the back of her feet and a little bit on each toe. And I also put in some sparse wrinkles on her foot and ankle. The next day I'll do the top part of her foot by rolling out strips going up her toes and foot, let it cure for a little bit, and then scoring in where the individual scales are. I'd love to do them more detailed, but I have to come to terms with the time and ability that I have available to me. Now that the feetsies are done, I can work on the rest of her body. I wanted to use something else to bulk her, but I couldn't find anything at the store, so I just used the light instead. I was worried that it would take a lot, but I still had leftovers of the package that I had been using. I heavily go over her chest and legs, and put some on her arms as well for good measure. It's okay if it's not smooth or symmetrical because, I mean, look at her. This is the only project that I'm allowing myself to go ham on without needing to sand every 2 minutes, so the fact that she's deformed or whatever isn't even an issue. I'm not worrying about things that I can't fix anymore, like the length of her torso or the width of her hips. We're all just going to have to live with it. When that bulk has cured, I'll start putting in more texture. I started with her legs because I needed to hold her body a lot to access those areas. I wanted to have the same textures on her throughout, so I used some amazing mold putty to make some stamps for this. It's a 1-to-1 ratio 2-part thing that you can squish onto something, for example the scale textures on her feet, leave it for about half an hour, and then use to your heart's content. Apparently it's food safe and can withstand temperatures of 300 degrees Fahrenheit / 150 degrees Celsius, which should be enough to cure polymer clay. The putty that I used was really old, so the mold release that's in the putty makes it really greasy. New one might not have as much of this problem. I tried to use the stamp on the inside part of her leg. I wanted those tiny individual scales there and not have them be an extraordinary difference in size from the ones on her feet or from either leg. Most of my clays weren't picking up the negative of the texture that was on the stamps, only epoxy really seemed to be able to reflect. This being Paperclay, it really just was not having texture stamped on. I had to go in and manually add in those scales, many of which were rolled on in the same way that I did the feet so they look decent. It's not the end of the world if these don't look amazing, but if I can get them looking good, then I want to do that. I realized that I wasn't crazy about the cap on the wire that I used for her hips. I'm fine with it being a spur like this, but having just one random spur felt weird, and the skip from the bulk to the plain Barbie leg was also weird. I rolled up some more spurs to put around the hip joint to try and blend it a little better, moving her legs around to make sure that none of these little accent spurs would get in the way of the main one, as they were still moving around when I would reposition her legs. The epoxy stuck magnificently to the Delight, and I wound up only chipping one of these spurs by the end, which is okay because it gives her character. After those were cures, I went in and added the scale texture to the rest of her legs. I put down a layer of Paperclay Delight and sculpted the scales on that instead of making snakes of clay like I did with the epoxy part. I'm making sure to have the same amount of rows on her shins and her thighs, and I did my best to have the same amount of scales on each row as well. I figured that if I can get any kind of symmetry anywhere, this is a decent place to have it. At least I can say that I tried. I also tried to add in tinier scale spurs leading up to her hips so that it's not completely stark. These aren't symmetrical. Her head was Moreira's, so it already had holes in it. I couldn't really use it for a proper doll, so I'll jam some new wires into new holes and make a base for the skull. A little bit of foil gives me a place to put the Paperclay Delight in this first go at it. I did this before I finished her body, so hopefully the size won't be too out of place. For the second pass, for some reason, I wanted to make sure that I had some of the sharp things like teeth and horns and spikes ready to put just in case. They're going to be made of Sculpey Ultralight, naturally. I've used this instead of Cosplay, and from what I understand, its cured version is pretty similar on a small scale like this, but it can absolutely be rebaked and maintain its minor elasticity. I can't compare the weight, but I trust Ultralight. Kneads like air dry clay, bakes like regular Sculpey, mixes with Sculpey to make a clay, or liquid Sculpey to make a putty, smooths with mineral oil, sands pretty well, is arguably worth a try if you use polymer clays. My other videos show it better. It's gonna help to take things slow with this, but another thing to do early is to get something like a joint for her neck. I put a couple glass beads on a wire, one to anchor, and one because I thought I might need it for how I might have to do the neck. On the second pass of the head, I connect her rhino horn and bulk it just a little bit more. I'll let that dry and bulk her jaw and horns and get my broken tooth pulled. Then I glue in a couple of beads for where her eyes are going to be. I drip some super glue over her horns and jaw to try to make them a little bit stronger. I'm not worried about the texture that it leaves because it's going to be covered up with textures like the ones that I'm trying to put on her horns. On the next passes, I'll start putting in her scale texture. I think it took 3 passes to get her full head covered, so I wouldn't squish anything. When it's mostly done, I'll put in the cuticle on her horns and texture that as well. I'll put in her eyelids, which didn't take long at all, wait for it to dry, and put in her brows. I'm putting in some spikes at the edge like some snakes and lizards have. I let the clay dry and then remove the spikes so that they don't break, as I don't exactly have extras of these ones that I made. Learning from Hazel and Chimera, the order of operations is very important, which is why I don't have her teeth in at this point. But when the brows are dry and the inside of her mouth is well sculpted so that you can't see it, I can put in some gums and stick in the teeth to do the same thing. I did the top jaw, let it dry, pulled them out, and did the bottom jaw. I'll take those teeth out when it dries as well so that they don't break either, and I'll replace them all after I've painted the head. I made some snake lips for her. I did the top ones and put in heat pits for detail. Honestly, they came out kind of big for my taste even after I fixed them a little bit. I put in some similar ones on her bottom jaw and also put in a place to have some spikes there. Anybody else here got PCOS? Queen representin'. I'll treat them like the other spikes and remove them when the clay's dry. I put some super glue on the ends of her ram horns, added a couple scoots on the back of her head, and made a little posable tongue for her with some thin wire and Sculpey bacon bend. That's all for her head until we put her together. The hands took me a while to get right. On the first pair that I made, I had the armature made from 2 different wires for some reason, had ultralight claws attached with liquid Sculpey, and an incorrect number of digits with claws that didn't match the talons. They turned out really big and stumpy and honestly looked just like Bowser's hands. The second pair of hands put the digits and claws into consideration. I used 1 length of wire for the main hand and put in a sort of wrist joint as I did with the first pair. I put tiny hoops at the end of the armature for the digits in hopes that the clay would make some kind of a connection to make an anchor to keep them on. If there's one thing about Ultralight that makes it hard to use, it's that it does not want to stick to armatures. These little hoops really won't do anything to keep the clay on there, so you shouldn't expect that from it, but it might help if you use it alongside liquid Sculpey. The claws didn't actually fall off while I was doing these, but they were breaking all over the place for this reason. I did partial cures for the clay. I didn't have the opportunity to cure the claws fully as I was working on them, but I was really concerned about squishing them as I worked, so I did the next best thing, which is boil them. Boiling clay is not a method to fully cure it, as boiling temperature is more than 50 degrees Fahrenheit lower than Sculpey's curing temperature, but it will get it a little bit harder than uncured clay. You can work on top of it without having to worry about it squishing like uncured clay would. You do have to be careful with it, as this will leave your clay very fragile, but if you absolutely need to have clay that is harder than it is uncured, a boil in water will do good enough until you can cure it fully. I think some people only boil their polymer clay pieces, but I wouldn't trust that to make it last myself. For the third pair of hands, I made an armature similar to the one that I made for the second pair. I did a full cure of her ultralight claws on the ends of her digits. These ones took me about 6 hours to sculpt the pair. I was constantly checking the size against each other and her body. They're still a tiny bit big, but they look much better than the other two pairs. On this one, I made the palms longer than the armature wire was, so I couldn't stick the wire in to make the joint the way that I had my last two pairs. I just put in a wire near the end of her hand and cut out a little notch to access it after the clay was cured. I figured to try doing it the way that people do their BJD hands with the little wire anchors. I'm not expecting the Super Sculpey to hold up on its own like this, so I'm prepared to use epoxy over anything if it breaks, or just attach them permanently if the arms don't want to cooperate with these hands either. I was kind of tired of trying by the time I made these hands. In between doing these pairs of hands, I did the scaling on her arms. I based the size on the first pair of hands, but they don't look out of place against either of the other two pairs. Against the rest of the body, maybe, but not against the hands. As far as the wings go, they made me do the great big I have the arm parts of them taken care of, but I really wanted them to be a full hand like a bat's wings. I did a few tries to make it happen with 4 different kinds of wires and a good enough amount of epoxy, but none of it worked the way that it needed to. Be it because the epoxy wasn't doing what I needed it to, or because the wires were not the right strength, and mostly because they were darn heavy. I figured that if I would be able to stand the whole wing up on itself, then it would be fine. I had to bite the bullet on how the wings were going to be more like a pterodon's wings, which isn't what I wanted, but it's the only thing that might work out. At the very least, I got in a wrist joint of sorts. I bore a hole through the monster high wrist that I had in order to get the wire of the wing in through there. I was concerned that it might break the wrist, but it turned out fine as far as I'm aware. The joining here is like in the neck joint for Mariana, where it can essentially move in 2 dimensions, but isn't very quite mobile while doing it. That's fine by me. Honestly, I really should have thought about making the elbows double jointed, but I guess I didn't even consider it. If you make something with wings like this, then put a double joint so that they can fold really nicely. As far as the wing membranes go, I want to put it over the wing that I have right now. I'll cut it out of my fabric and sew the top part as a sleeve over the bones that I have here. Bones. Because I want to put some clay over top of this so that it looks, decent. Bulked up with texture and not just some raw fabric here. I want to use Delight for this because of the weight and because almost all of her is textured with that. I covered the arms of her wings with aluminum foil to give it a barrier to put on the basic cover. I'll let it cure and then go in with some more Delight to bulk it even more and add in texture. I did my best to keep them even. Besides that, I need to make sure that the rest of her is good and set before I permanently attach these big road hazards. I'll super glue the arm covers onto the wings when they're set in place. The neck and tail could absolutely not be static pieces. The goal is to have them both be at least a little bit flexible, if not completely posable. First of all, I need the parts. I'm going to sculpt them out of Super Sculpey because I don't actually need it to be cured in order to get the mold for this, and because it's the hardest clay that I have. I made the skeletons out of just aluminum foil, covered them in Super Sculpey, and carved in all of the details. I'm also putting in these big scoots all along both of them. It sucks because the clay is soft enough to pick up the shape of whatever I rested on, which is the only time that Super Sculpey has stayed soft hours after kneading it. This stuff isn't easy for me to condition. I need to make molds of these, and the way that I'm going to do this is with alginate. I don't need these to be permanent, and silicone would have wound up making this harder to do. I didn't do any research before choosing this material or even while I was using it, so the next part is probably stupid to people that know how to use alginate. While the alginate was curing, I went and put in the texture on the rest of her body. I marked off where the small scales would go and where the scales like the ones on her tail were going to meet. It doesn't really have a transition because I couldn't comprehend how to make one, so it looks pretty gross, but I don't care. I'm using this perfect mold stuff and I'm currently reporting back. It's a weird ratio, but I tried to do the math to make the right amount for the stupid box that I made out of my contact lens solution box to fit in these things. I made a little more than I needed. I wasn't too sure how the volume of the powder would be affected by the water. It mostly eats it down, but there's definitely still volume left by the powder. It's not like you're dealing with flour, but it isn't powdered sugar, if that makes sense. The water does, however, completely affect the weight of your mold, but as long as it's mostly sealed up at the edges, then you shouldn't have to worry too much about it leaking. I didn't get any leaks with my mold box, which should be telling. It sets up in only a few minutes, but I left it for a few days just to make doubly extra certain that it's completely dry. Florida, humidity, you know. Well, even that long didn't make the mold dry. I don't think it's normal that it's still so wet, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because apparently alginate doesn't stick to itself. I did some partial batches to try to get stuff like the scale detail in the molds for sure. The alginate did pick up the texture, which is good to know, but as that was a really thin layer, it stuck to the sculpt and not the rest of the mold around it. There are two good things that I learned from this. Alginate is good at picking up the texture in a piece, and it's going to be easy to make a two-part mold with this stuff, which is actually what I wanted from it. The bad is that I had to pick off all of the residue from the master, fix any parts that got damaged, and recast it in something that isn't my initial contact lens box because that was soaked through completely. I still have enough powder to mix up another try at this. The biggest thing that held me up actually was the casting container. That one was more or less perfect size, but was unusable after that first try, so I needed something else. I searched far and wide for something that could do it, with or without a hardy duct tape layer to keep cardboard together, and then remembered that I have some storage bins under my bed that will probably work for 3 of 5 sides of either mold box. So I just need partitions for them, which is way easier to find. Moral of the story, don't make masterpieces that are 15 by 3 by 3 inches because you won't easily find a container that you can use as a mold box. It was almost perfect. If I had the tiniest bit more alginate, or if I were able to better distribute what I had, my mold for the tail would have been good. But as it is, I have a few gaps and thin spaces that I don't really know how to handle. I think the other half is usable, probably. So what I did was cast the pieces in silicone. There are 2-part epoxies that are flexible out there, albeit more difficult to find than printing resin, but I was concerned with the flexibility. What I was finding in the descriptions was something called shore hardness, which is the resistance a material has to indentation from something called a durometer, according to smoothon.com. I was finding examples of certain shore hardnesses, but not examples of how flexible those things actually were, which, would help me decide what product to use. Lower numbers are softer, and as I was seeing it, the easiest to bend. I need these pieces to bend easily and hold the pose of an armature wire. I was caught up between shore hardnesses between 10A and 30A, but again couldn't find direct examples of the flexibility. I wound up buying a molding silicone with a 10A shore hardness for way more money than what I actually got, and it is really, really soft. I was actually surprised at the collaboration between the silicone and the alginate. Just about every detail was captured. The bulk of the neck turned out pretty okay. I tried to glue the pieces that I had of it together with more silicone since that stuff only sticks to itself. And it seems like letting this stuff cure for a while before using it in certain places helps it hold the shape you need better. It holds a pose, but I honestly should have bent a loop in the middle of the wire because I'm a little worried that it might want to slip out of place. I did go ahead and use that armature trick for the tail. As far as that one goes, the top part of the mold fell apart before I could use it, so the only thing that got casted from it were some of the scoots on here. I still used it on the second layer of silicone for the tail anyway. The bottom half is passable, but I don't think that there's anything that I can do to salvage the top with the materials that I have. So here's my conclusion on this Lux Resin brand of silicone mold at 10A shore hardness in the color teal. The bottle is really not that big. If you can get it during the sale, buy it then and not 3 days after it ends. $70 for this bare bones starter kit is a little bloated. As far as the product itself, it picks up details really well. I can imagine it making really good molds of things with really intricate details. The only thing about that is that the cured silicone is really soft. I'd say it's comparable to the plastic that they use on those little mochi silicone animals. So keep that in mind if you're looking at 10A shore hardness. I guess it'd be fine for making thin material items, like maybe an intricate chocolate mold, but I don't know if it's food safe. The tail has to be redone. I scraped off all of the master's clay to get an approximation on the amount of clay that I would need to remake it. With a little bit of the length cut down and a new spur club at the end of her tail, I took a gamble on using Sculpey bacon bend clay, as I have an incredibly limited supply of it. I don't think that specific one is available anymore, and I don't want to try the Bake and Flex or Bake Shop versions of flexible Sculpey clay right now. I had just enough to make a new tail, but I'm not confident that I can make a neck with the leftover scraps. I'm not super happy with how it came out, but I'm not exactly happy with any other part of her either, so it's fine. I'm excited to put her together. It's been a month of having bits and pieces of her coming to be, and now I'm going to start sewing her into one big item. I'm starting with the neck. I tried to make a bend at either end of the wire in the silicone neck so that it plays nicer. I looped the wire on the bottom onto one that I had left available in her body. I made sure it was nice and secure. I had a bead as a placeholder for the neck, but I don't need it. I'm just gonna stab the wire from the head into the neck. It's anchored inside the head at this point, and while I'd love to twist the wires together, I don't want to accidentally break the silicone. What tail are we going with? The clay one. It's probably going to look better as far as width goes. It's heavy and doesn't bend well, but at least it's not the silicone one. I didn't leave a hole in her bag big enough for the double wire, and the excess didn't want to be jammed up into her body, but I did a good enough job to keep it in there. I'll use hot glue to set them. This isn't going to be the only connection, but it's going to keep them still while I cover it up with epoxy. It'll look better blending into the tail, and I know that it's not going to give a good transition between Delight and silicone on the neck, but it's strong and it'll hopefully keep it from jostling around too much. I stabbed some little needles in there to try and keep anything from moving. The texture on the epoxy parts are pretty vile, but I don't care. If I can fix it with sanding, then great, but if not, I don't care. If someone can get 5 different textured clays to look good together, then they're a darn good sculptor, and I am not a darn good sculptor. So the fam just so happened to be going out of town for the weekend. The place that I wanted to get pics of my dragon was on the table, but not decided until the day before we left. I could either expedite the painting or take my time with it to make it perfect. It wasn't going to turn out better if I did take my time on it. It's fine. I based her in a dark blue so that I could get all of the scales defined when I dry brush over it. Or that was the idea. Even adding a bunch of water didn't get the base paint into all of the crevices. It's whatever. The neck and wings were to determine the shades that I would use, as the color of these couldn't be changed, but I went and did something else anyway. I was attached to her white nails, so I did those and her spurs in a light blue. The scoots on her back are really dark blue, and her horns are kind of a slate color because I didn't want them blending in or looking too repetitive. The last bits were done off camera because of how clunky she is. I was sealing her with watered down Duraclear gloss, but it was letting little dust stay on her and kind of chipped the tiniest bits of paint, so I begrudgingly went over it with watered down matte. I was concerned that it would be glossier than the straight matte that I used on her horny bits, but it looks fine. I worked on her paint job for like 15 hours straight with like maybe 1 total hour of breaks in between, and I had to get up early to leave, so I wasn't quite as careful with her teeth and spikes as I know I should have been. I hope they don't look the worst. The clay of her head was really soft while I was doing this for some reason, but not soft enough to let the things in easily. I also didn't write down which spikes go on her chin, and I think I got some wrong, but it's fine. Well, there you have it. A full-time job's worth through a month and a week and at least 5 days of inhibited breathing in relation to get me here at the end. Is she perfect? No, of course not. I'll be the first to say it. But she was a good enough use of the rage that I had going into this project. In reference to her inspiration at the start to make me have her be just one color, her name is Spite. You're all lucky that I can control myself as not to include the rant portion of this video because that would have made this very, very long. But maybe some other time. Be sure to check out all of the vids in the collab and to follow the crew on YouTube and Instagram. Again, the people in this collab were Shelby KG Dolls, Hedgie Dolls, Heliophobiant Dolls, Stitchwood Creations, Yo Snap, and Magikcat Dolls.